Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. This is another Fireside Chat, and I do love these conversations, so I hope everybody else does as well. And this one is called Moving from a 503B to the Production of 505B2s, Generic Drugs, and Orphan Drugs. And I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves. Why don't we start with you, Ken?
Yeah, hi. My name is Ken Kengatharan. I trained as a cardiovascular pharmacologist in London and also at Stanford. Over the last 20 years, I've set up multiple biotech companies. I also run a fund that was established 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago. Now focused mainly on orphan rare diseases. Majority of the companies that I co-founded, I've been the head of R&D, and even to this day, I look at the data that's developed in the clinical development space. Very much interested in commercialization and personalized medicine. Thank you.
Tom, why don't you jump?
Sure. I'm Tom Kupiec. My background's in forensic toxicology and my doctorate's in pharmaceutical sciences. And I have the CEO of ARL Biopharma, a pharmaceutical testing laboratory that specializes in testing and quality control for 503A, 503B, big pharma, research and development institutions, as well as hospital research institutions. We have a DNA company called DNA Solutions. We do a lot of genetics, human. Both companies are ISO 17025, and we work along law enforcement, FBI on sexual assaults, forensic genealogy, and with law enforcement. And then we do a fair amount of attorney and immigration and some other interesting side projects. And then the Kupiec Group, which is a think tank of individuals that solves unusual problems for high net worth individuals, government entities, insurance companies, and attorneys in the area of forensics. And so those are the three areas that I work in.
Great. Syed, do you want to go?
Yes, my name is Syed Saleem. I'm a pharmacist in charge at Kelly Boyd's prescription shop. We are a 503B pharma manufacturing. We primarily compound pellets and sterile injectables. I've been in the industry for about 20 years. I have a doctor of pharmacy, licensed in 24 states. I have good knowledge with the compounding industry, pre and post DQSA. So I've been familiar with the evolution and the regulations and going forward. So I also have MBA, a lot of certifications, also sterile, non-sterile, PDA, FDA. I have some good background with the company pharmacist on the 503B and pharma industry.
I think we're not able to hear Syed that well.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
No, it sounds like you're muted, Syed.
Yeah.
Am I?
It sounds like it's muffled, really. It's coming across muffled on my, I don't know if
Syed,
it is on
do you have a headphones you can use?
Not at the moment.
All right, well, Syed, while you look for headphones, Lee, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Lee Rosebush. I've got a whole host of titles here. I'll go through real quickly. One is I serve as the chair of the FDA practice as well as the chair of the pharmacy and reimbursement teams at Baker Hostetler. I also serve as the chair and general counsel of the Outsourcing Facility Association, or OFA. It's the 503B Trade Association. I'm on the board of the American Society of Pharmacy Law, and I also serve on the board of the American Pharmacovigilance Society, which is a trade association looking at adverse events for pharma.
Hi, Vivian. I think we lost you. You may be back now.
Yeah, I think we lost Syed
There we go.
for headphones. Let's give him a minute. Oh, there he is.
Hopefully.
You good?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Let's hear. You want to try introducing yourself again?
Sure. Can you hear me now?
He's still muffled. Maybe.
Just speak up, okay? Because I think it's just very low.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Wonderful. My name is Syed Saleem. I'm a pharmacist in charge at Perry Boy's prescription shop. We make primarily hormone pellets and sterile injectables. I've been in the industry about 20 years. I have multiple licenses in different states. I have a good regulatory compliance program. I've been in the compound industry for about 20 years. Seen through DQSA, coming in 2013, pre-DQSA, and followed through now, and the evolution of the pharmacy and compounding industry in general.
Excellent. So we have, just like our other fireside chat, we had some objectives. The first one, we'll just use this to launch into our conversation, is to review the future market potential, especially as there is a move towards precision medicine for pre-disease subsets. And I know, Ken, you wanted to kick us off with this.
Yeah, I thought perhaps Syed or Tom could say a few words about the 503B and the impact on 505B2 for anyone who is not familiar with that space, and then I can probably jump in on the market opportunity so that everybody knows in what context are we talking.
Syed, do you want to go first? And actually, Lee would probably be better being over the organization 503B as well. So why don't you, Lee, you and Syed take the aspect of it, and then I can jump in on the quality and some of the science aspect.
Sure, Syed. Go ahead.
So, as we know that the reason 503B came into existence is because of an incident happened in the 2012, 2013. Because of NECC, there were some medicines manufactured, and there was some fatalities due to the not so cleanliness or insanitary conditions. For that reason, the 503B came into existence to try to fill the gap between the pharma manufacturers and large compounders. So 503B is basically a compounding pharmacy in a larger scale with similar scrutiny as a FDA pharma manufacturer. 503B needs to follow all the guidelines. There is FDA issued a special guidelines for CGMP. It kept evolving, and the last guideline was issued in January of 2020. So the way they structure the 503B is so they don't mimic any of the manufactured product. At the same time, they are not able to like the 503A used to do. They could make products which are in short supply. They could make products which are needed by the physicians in a larger scale. Also the hospitals, things of that nature. They do have the category 1, 2, and 3 lists. So category 1 list basically lists the medicine or APIs which you can use for compounding. Category 2 list is, again, not to be used. 3 is absolutely not. Again, this list keeps changing. Once in a while, some medicines or APIs are added and some are removed. So basically, 503B needs to be manufacturing the product as per the FDA guidelines, following the CGMP, CFR, and also the list provided. Hope that helps. Lee, you want to add something?
Sure. The unique thing about 503Bs, as most know, is that they sort of sit in between the pharmacy space and the drug manufacturing space. And so they're used to producing drugs through the CGMP process. But one of the things that I think is starting to progress the industry forward, move towards NDAs and ANDAs. Well, many of the 503B facilities at this point have 6 and 7 years worth of data associated with a lot of these products, whether they be through formulation and CMC-related data, adverse event-related data, and how their products are being used. And so the question becomes, is could you take a lot of that that's currently available to them, as well as what's publicly available through PubMed, and start to look towards getting approvals through the 505(b)(2) space? And I think we're going to start to see more and more of this. There's certain companies that are already moving towards this. Obviously, Infomess has made it known publicly. Atheneos has got several products at this point where they mine the data off of the FDA's 503B list and then move towards. You can look at Endo with their vasopressin product, Nexus with their phenylepinephrine product, which are really paper 505B2s, which again have been products that have been around in the compounding space for nearly 100 years. And so as we progress, I think it's starting to become more and more that you'll start to see more of these progress from 503Bs into the actual NDA or ANDA space.
Great.
I think it's interesting to note that from the quality attributes that are looked at, full GMP, Big Pharma has a very strict guidance and regime that you would go through for the quality control and potency or sterility and stability for GMP type products made in the manufacturer space. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, let's say you have the 503As, where the 503Bs tend to be for GMP, but not at the extraneous or at the level of that, as many runs or as many repeats. And I think that they do want, you have to be at GMP, but not at the level, at the full GMP, what I call Big Pharma perspective, as far as the quality that's needed for 503Bs. And it's interesting because testing compounded products for over 2 decades, you definitely see that. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity for these 503Bs to move into this the generic or orphan drug market. And there's a lot of opportunities.
Great. I think that's a great introduction. So I can give my view as a drug developer and very interested in what we call therapeutic management, which I think is the future where the pharmaceutical industry is heading. Which is beyond just a drug to help people manage their diseases. So in this respect, I don't know if you guys have been are aware that the future is going toward precision medicine. You've seen this in a huge way in oncology. Starting with Hostetler is probably one of the pioneers in that space. Mainly because most drugs don't work on everyone. Even Lipitor, for instance, is known to work in no more than 20 to 30% of the people that it's prescribed. It's just that the rest of them, it doesn't cause major adverse events for it to be a concern. So the question then becomes, which side of the that equation do you want to be in? And recent times, there now, what's happening is there's a form of feedback, not only for knowing whether a drug is going to work in a particular patient or a particular group of patients, but also knowing which patient profile is going to benefit from a certain drug. This is becoming a huge thing in the orphan rare disease space because these patients are very, very sensitive, not only for what they get, but also the dose adjustment. This is one of the main reasons, for instance, in epilepsy, in orphan epilepsy, the majority of the prescription is really the brand, even though there are multiple generics that are available, because going from one generic to another, you just don't know whether you're preserving the PK/PD profile of the main drug. And in this respect, as we get to a smaller and smaller group, which you're going from the common diseases down to orphan and then rare and ultra rare, you're talking about very few patients, sometimes, single digit number of patients in the United States and maybe, low double digit in the entire world, which means, a compounding pharmacy is the best avenue for them to get the drugs they need. And this is why I have a lot of interest in the 503B space, because from my point of view, it's not about the drug. It's about how do you manage that particular person's disease, where drug is just one component of it. And that's why I'm very interested in creating companies, what we call therapeutic management companies rather than drug companies. So the question then becomes, what are the things that are going to happen over time, just like what happened in oncology? Because I don't know if many of you know, 15 years ago, it was all, oncology did not have many drugs. It was cytotoxic agents, which works on all cancers, etc. And then what happened in the subsequent 15 years is the cancer as a disease got subdivided into smaller subsets along biomarkers, etc. And of course, you know, with that smaller subset means you can apply for an orphan designation and you know, get the benefit, etc. And that which happened in oncology is not going to happen in other diseases. I actually coined the word orphanization to show that if you can take a common disease and divide it into subsets, orphan subset, and then create drugs for them. Now, if you go down to a smaller subset, then the best way to help these patients is through a compounding pharmacy, in my opinion. So I just wanted to throw out there saying what the future is going to be, and compounding pharmacy has a major role in it, and hopefully, it could be a huge outcome for orphan rare disease patients.
Well, Tom, I've actually got a question for you, and Ken sort of was hitting on this. It's a follow-up to our conversation that we had earlier in our last Fireside. You know, the question becomes, as we start to move down towards from 503B into sort of the approval processes, right, to get a drug approved through 505B2, what type of data and how are FDA going to look at data that comes from a 503B as compared to how the data is obtained through the traditional methods as of now, right, through traditional double-blinded studies from pharma companies? And I think that's one of the things that we as an industry are sort of going to have to tweak and get a better understanding from the agency, is how are they going to look at data that we've obtained over the last 7 years that may not have been through that traditional style, but still could be very valuable, right? It goes to that sort of the end of one study we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I think that's a very insightful question. I think there's going to be a problem with that, looking at the data, because the data may not have been acquired under the same conditions. You may, just like the issues that we see in compounding world of potency versus full validated stability indicating methods determined beyond use dating. So just running an LC or GC or getting one value is completely different than using a method that should be done appropriately for full GMP levels. So if you present any data for the agency to be able to review, they need to ensure that it meets that criteria at that certain level. I mean, that's why, you run samples and you test, whether it be an active pharmaceutical ingredient or a drug substance or a reference standard or compounded for 503A, 503B, or big pharma. You need to understand those regulations and the compliance requirements for that. So there's going to be a problem extracting data that you've done anecdotal and then saying using this for an orphan drug. I think that's the big issue here. I think Ken is right on target in saying, hey, and Syed, we have a lot of opportunities, but isn't that the issue in big picture, that you have a small population base? Ken is saying on some of these orphan drugs, it's maybe single digits. How can you get a compounding pharmacy to compound? I mean, they can do it, but then they're not. I think the idea is looking more at the approach than just the outcome. I think the solution to the problem is not just necessarily the outcome, but the approach to the solution to the problem. And so in verifying and validating your process is ensuring that you can accurately and follow all the different aspects of that formulation. So I think it entails both compliance and science in the compilation of that orphan drug if the compounding pharmacy is going to do it. And today we're lacking a lot of the basic science aspect from the old pharmaceutics perspective versus where maybe their focus is, whether it be pharmacoeconomics or clinical or some other aspect. So I think you can't be all things to all people, but I'm not a member of the FDA, and so the FDA agency can only tell you what they would require. But I know I have a lot of confidence in the FDA, just like on the vaccine issues. The people say, how could the vaccines get done in 1 year, Well, there's no doubt we have a very safe and effective aspect, and they're not going to let something go through. They're charged with safety and efficacy, so there's a certain standard. But I think there's a good way to approach it, like we did with the 503Bs. And I think just now, as we're having these discussions like Ken and Syed and you and I are discussing today about moving 503B, which is more GMP-like type institutions, into that generic and orphan drug. Particularly, I think there's an opportunity in the ANDA or the generic market from a commercial perspective.
And I've always wondered that, right? And I get this question a lot from my clients, setting aside the trade association, is, look, we have all of this formulation data. We have all this equivalent to a CMC data at this point that we've produced, a lot of it, especially for shortage products. Could you take that data and then infer or refer, right, to the data that's publicly available through PubMed and get a 505B2 at that point?
You know, that's an excellent question. This reminds me of what's happened in the past when they use in the USP, it says for professional judgment. What your professional judgment, my professional judgment, for Syed and Ken, we all may have different perspectives or criteria for professional judgment. That's why you need set guidelines for what's required. And I think many individuals, I think I have a lot of data, but does it really meet? I would question, does that meet the CMC section as a new IND drug being submitted to the FDA for clinical trials or for routine manufacturing?
Right. I mean, since we are talking about a 505B2, I mean, we are talking about a drug that's already you already know what the safety profile is, right? And you already know the brackets under which, from a dose point of view, what the safety profile is. And then it's a question of the compounding pharmacy figuring out what is the optimal dose for that particular patient is, right? Then the question is, it really then comes down to CMC. That's what this whole matter is about. The question is, can you give enough confidence to regulators and physicians and others that you're preserving the CMC specifications of a larger batch in a smaller batch in a particular pharmacy? That's the key question here.
The other thing, what in the 505B2, the category list one. Basically, for the 503Bs, the FDA is restricting to the list, the category list. That's another sort of bottleneck or roadblock that Lee would probably be able to explain.
It is, and it sort of combines what we're talking about here, right? I mean, if I'm somebody who's in Ken's shoes and wants to be an investor, right, in some of these drugs, it really is a way that you could take the current 503B list one and say, look, FDA has recognized there's at least information there to determine whether or not there's a clinical need, which goes to the efficacy question, right? And if you've got the CMC type-ish data, it begs the question of why many more aren't going and having that pre-IND meeting to say, look, FDA, this is what I've got. Do I, in essence, have a paper 505B2? It's not any different than what I know did with vasopressin. It's not any different than what Nexus did, right, with the phenylepinephrine products. You can look at what Fresenius has done now with about 15 products that are on the shortage list. So it really is begging the question with that bulk list one is could you really do a paper filing?
Well, how do I say this? I think that there are many people that are actually doing that, we see that, what you just mentioned, that are taking that data or they know that the need is there, the clinical need, and they know that there's a shortage, and so they're using this approach to that. All I'm saying is I'm not confident at all the level of testing is at that CMC level that you can just take and wrap it up and put a bow on it and say, this is my 503B2, or this is my packet for the FDA inspection. Because my understanding is the regulatory requirements are more stringent, and so yes, they may think they have it, but do they really have it?
To me, I agree with you. I think what it does is it gives you the nice package to walk in for your pre-IND meeting, right? To say, this is what I've got. What more do you need at that point?
Yeah, it's really, I think, to be competitive today, we need to be more collaborative and community-minded. To have a competitive intelligence, I think we're looking at not competitive intelligence, but competitive market. We're looking at creative ways to move things like Ken to invest for 503B into these 505B2 generics or orphan drugs. How do we do that? Well, if you know that there's a clinical need, you're right. Syed and others, there are the compounding pharmacists that are in this market, they are primed to take that drug through it. I think there's a lot of information, and it's just like as we're bringing in this discussion, the one we had earlier, you bring in the people to the table to actually collaborate and say, here's what we need are the pieces, and then approach the FDA to present that.
Right. Yeah, at that point, to me, you've got your clinical need question. It's begging you, okay, what more do you need at that point to move forward with it and be done with it? And you can look at that's what sort of Civica and Flow has done, right? I mean, Flow has done it more from an API. They're working with Civica to make the drugs too. And so it seems to me that's where the market is heading. And it seems to be what FDA wants, right? Because they keep pushing towards wanting the FDA approval process, right? And even if you look at just yesterday when they released the 5 substances, it was still 1 approved, 4 against because of the clinical need discussion. They're wanting that FDA approved product.
Right.
So a question for Lee. Companies like Civica, Civic RX, can they also have a 503B arm in addition to their main generics business, or do you have to decide which ones you want to play in?
So Civica doesn't. Civica is a straight CMO, right? Basically what they do is they contract out for their APIs and contract with CMOs to make a distributor, and they're in essence a wholesaler. But if you look at some of the others, Fresenius is a great example. Fresenius has a 503B, and obviously they're a huge pharma company, right? And Mylan has partnered with and has a 503B as well as obviously a big pharma company. And so there are some out there who are using sort of the 503B space to go out and mine that data to look at what the 6-month product report is. Sort of, I don't want to say cash flow, but you could actually make some cash while you're doing your CMC development, right? Because you're in essence making your product. And then you're able to cash flow the IND perspective, right, through your 503B and get the approval at that point. And then once you're approved, there's many of them, I'm not saying it's right, but there's many of them who are going then after the 503Bs to clear the market because they're saying you're an essential copy at that point.
Yeah, and I think companies like Fresenius, you could argue that if they're delivering, the drug and some other aspect of it, say for instance in dialysis, you give the drug and the dialysis as one treatment for which you're getting a single reimbursement, that actually makes sense. So the 503B groups would become very, very helpful, especially dealing with orphan rare diseases. Then you can have a nice reimbursement, and that then subsidize all of your other activities. In the business that I'm in, not too long ago, there was a huge rush towards 505B2 type projects, finding a new use for an old drug, new delivery, etc. It kind of went away along with poor performance of the specialty pharma, because that's where they were. It's mainly because of the exclusivity and reimbursement capabilities, and so this is where I think if the cost of doing the work to bring those drugs to market is very expensive, then the next cut down is the 503B and compounding pharmacy to help, especially in a small group of patients. And then one could go for what I have always called, minimum viable label, as it were. Almost like a minimum viable product, where you have a very cut down, very simple label, which talks about the efficacy, even that which has been done by academic groups, and then a smaller CMC section, which then gives confidence to the regulators that a 503B organization could handle it. If that happens, so many drugs could be back on the market helping orphan rare disease patients.
Oh, I 100% agree with you. And there are others that you could look in a similar type of market. CAR-T was one that we talked about earlier that I think is a perfect example, right? You've got $1 million product, but your N is 1 or 2 people because you're in essence looking for a very specific subset. Another would be BHRT, right, that we had talked about previously, where you may be tied to a lab in a situation where you've got a very specific amount of drug that's needed, and you can determine that based on a lab, and then you can individualize it for the compounded pharmacy. So I think there are certain disease states which are made for the 503B, right?
Absolutely.
The question that becomes is what do the 503Bs do for the next round of, right, for business growth? And it's could they take some of that data that they have and then turn around and get the approvals that we're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Syed educated me yesterday on something very important. When I read about it, I was quite amazed at the fact that the biologics compounding pharmacy and biologics don't go together anymore. And in fact, they've started removing drugs from that list that was all previously compound. I think so. Where do you think that's gonna? I mean, maybe Syed, if you could brief everybody on, what's been happening, because this whole thing happened in the last 1 year, if I remember correctly, all the FDA guidance or thereof. And where do you see the biologics compounding heading? I mean, you're talking about even small peptides you cannot compound anymore.
That's right. So basically, there is again, as I was referring earlier, the Category 1 list. That's basically the list what FDA want all the 503Bs to follow. And in that list keeps changing, and there are some of those peptides and biologics. Those earlier pharmacists used to make, for example, Avastin, basically. So they used to repackage Avastin. That is now in a biologics. For example, HCG. Was out. So similarly, any of those oxytocin, I believe. I mean, that's another one. So any of these drugs, which are and also sourcing these particular biologics has become an issue because the distributors now need to have a separate biologic distribution license. They cannot hold this product anymore because it is under biologics now. So
interesting. In fact, Lee, you mentioned something about vasopressin. So, I mean, are people compounding vasopressin? Because that's clearly a biologic, a protein.
So they consider vasopressin in this situation to be a drug. And so it's still considered in that perspective under the drug route, not the biologic route. Interesting.
Yeah. So, because I saw the HCG and then also some of these other proteins that are used in fillings and stuff like that are now not allowed to be compounded, which is kind of terrible.
Yeah, it has made as somebody who represents the industry, it's made a huge impact. There are things like Avastin is another good example, right? Which think of wet macular degeneration. In addition to the onc route, HCG is another one where they are allowing repackaging, but they're not allowing you to compound in this situation. Even products like HCG that have been done for years and years. And so in essence, what you've got to do at this point is go buy the finished product. It should cost a huge shortage because the manufacturers are wanting to sell directly to the pharmacies, not directly to people who are going to repackage at this point. And so you're seeing a shortage from that perspective and an increase in price, a dramatic increase in price.
And all these are all detriment to that patient. I know hospital IV admixture programs have been compounded routinely biologics daily at the hospital. And, a couple of the other items that you mentioned besides Avastin, the Remicade, the Herceptin, the Rituxan, as well as the Enbrel has been compounded. I think in addition to these issues that you brought up from biologics or the proteins and peptides, which we see, is the analytical challenges in storage. It's not, these are not a small molecule you can just run on the LC. The LC triple quad or the other instrumentation utilized, there's factors such as the folding of the protein or the molecule, the charge. There's a lot of other quality attributes that would have to be considered in testing biologics that's different than traditional small molecules.
Yeah, interesting. Now, you mentioned Enbrel had been compounded before.
I have been, I understand that there has been. I don't know where, but I'm just giving you an idea. These are items that I believe have been compounded in some fashion.
Under 503B?
No, I don't think it was.
Okay, that's interesting. Maybe going to some of the points that we were meant to talk about, the challenges ensuring consistency of manufacturing, and this is of manufacturing quality. How are companies, 503B companies, handling this? Maybe Tom, this is a Tom question.
How are they handling
making sure the consistency of quality in manufacturing for small batches?
Well, it is a problem. I don't think that was like the point that Lee brought up earlier. I think that there's different levels. The 503A operates, or the requirements for it testing, they follow more the 795 and 797, the USP guidelines, versus the 503B, which are closer to GMP or full-blown GMP that we do for big pharma. So you have your still utilization, the traditional methodologies. USP 71, 85 for the antibodies, all the traditional microbial tests, antimicrobial effectiveness 51, all of those USPs are still utilized, but it's important to conduct the test, know how to conduct the test, and then make sure you have the, the person, place, and process at the level that's going to meet the compliance. It was about to like earlier. So if you have a 503A, that data I think is unlikely to be able to withstand a full CMC submission to the FDA for that piece. So when you're talking about how are the individual pharmacies handling it, each pharmacy at different levels. Now that being said, there are many very good 503As, and there are some 503Bs that could perhaps enhance some of their GMP level of quality. So it's sort of a continuum there.
I see. And quality is same regardless of which state the 503B organization is, right?
I don't know the regulations. That would be
quality systems is guided by the federal organization.
That's correct. Yeah, the FDA sets the standards for CGMP. Now, certain states like California and Florida have additional requirements that they may.
Yeah, exactly why I was asking. Yeah.
Right. But in essence, FDA, any 503B follows the FDA CGMP, and you would hope most states would also follow that same standard as well.
So theoretically, one could say, well, I'm not going to be under the federal guidance because I'm only going to be distributing within that state. Would that make a difference? So you work with different 503 organizations in different states for serving patients who are in that state?
So the FDA has got an interesting legal case on that. They say, look, if you purchase products, for example, that come out of the state as well, like an API or the bags or anything from that perspective, you're still interstate commerce and therefore you're still FDA regulated. So even if you were in the situation of 503B, let's just say in LA, and you were only doing business in the state of California, but you were buying product from outside and bringing it in, like the bags themselves, then you still are.
I see. That's interesting.
Yeah. Can I agree with Lynn? I would think regardless of the state that you're in, if you're a 503B, you need to meet those FDA 503B guidelines.
Yep. Yeah.
Interesting.
So that's, if you look at it, that's why we come back to, right? A lot of this data is going to be from CGMP. We could argue that there are certain areas of CGMP that may tweak from CMOs and drug manufacturers, but it's still CGMP, 21 CFR. And so I'll be very curious about some of the meetings that are happening moving forward, right, with some folks who are looking to get approvals, who have had this 6-7 years worth of CMC and adverse event data, to see how much the FDA is willing to adopt moving forward. Because to me, that's going to be the biggest question outstanding moving forward, is how does the FDA view that data that doesn't come from traditional, right, the traditional means of double-blinded studies, et cetera, from CROs.
Yeah, that's very interesting, very interesting. And also, if I remember correctly, you have to have the organization CGMP compliant, but also sometimes individual products related as well. That's still the case even for 503B situation?
Can you repeat that?
So, sometimes you have to have when we deal with manufacturers, we look at them as a company as well as for individual products. So they normally show us for this product, we've already had inspection and qualified as CGMP. Is that the same case for 503B as well?
503Bs are a little bit different in the fact that you report to the FDA every 6 months what you make. So, June and December, you tell the FDA, this is what we've done over the last 6 months. And 503Bs are limited if they're doing it from bulk to what's on that bulk's list. But, for example, I'll pick on Syed. If Syed in this situation wanted to do morphine today and wanted to do testosterone tomorrow, he could, right? Because as long as he's got the validated processes to move forward with it, then that's fine. As a 503B, you're not limited to one product, and that's actually what makes them unique. And you think about what happened with COVID, right? We weren't sure what the next drug shortage was going to be because people weren't, for example, expecting the drugs that needed to be used for vents, right? And so 503Bs were able to turn on a dime, unlike pharma, and it's because of that mechanism where you could do anything that's on that bulks list that we were talking about. That's why it's a slippery slope. It's going to be interesting to see what people take from that 503B list to go get approvals. But remember, as more people go get approvals, more drugs are going to come off that list. And then the uniqueness of it and the ability for 503Bs to be able to resolve some drug shortages could be reduced. So, yeah, right, it's sort of a public policy conundrum is which way do you want this to go? Do you want more approvals or do you want the ability to help resolve drug shortages easier and quicker?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, any thoughts from you, Syed, on using the 505(b)(2) logic for new use for an existing drug using the 503B path, because that sounds like it's a very a quick way to get new drugs for a new use, for instance, especially ones that already been approved for other indications.
I think that's a good way to go. But again, I think there are some documentation and submission issues. 55B2 does mention about the ANDA, and then there is three different kind of applications you can submit based on the one of the studies you have done. There's BLA, the BABE studies, any of the literature, and any of those categories. And if we are able to submit any of those ANDA applications for the existing product API. But the only thing which I think, again, Lee can clarify a little bit onto say manufacturing like medication. I mean, if it's any drug which is manufactured already, 503Bs are not supposed to mimic the similar drug. So those are the issues we run into, even if you go through the 505B2 route.
That's interesting. I mean, this is related to the last point about ROI. I mean, what I find it very interesting is that if there is a way for us to use the 505B2 for a drug that's been approved, say, for oral, and you're now using it for a rare disease that is skin, so you're doing topical. If one could use a 503B organization to achieve that, then you don't, and then show obviously any local toxicity and all that. One could theoretically approve drugs really fast or get it to patients' hands faster than the traditional 505B2 path for a new use, a new delivery drug. I mean, I like to throw it out there because this is huge if that is possible.
But Ken, are you inferring that an oral or a dosage form of an oral could be translated over to a transdermal or a skin drug delivery? I mean, there's a tremendous, I would think the formulation and all the bioavailability, and that's all going to be variable.
That's right. So the question is how much of that data that one needs to provide, especially from the safety point of view, because that's the one that's going to need the largest amount of patient exposure to show benefit.
I think it would be quite difficult. If I was, I think it'd be difficult to approve a dosage form from an oral over to a topical. I mean, even now with this, as you mentioned earlier, the earlier talk, Lee, about the skin, I mean, the creams, just the level of the studies that should be conducted on transdermal drug delivery and the vehicle has completely different outcomes. So if you're looking at clinical outcomes, I think there's a lot of issues here that one has to take into effect. It's the formulation, it's the outcome, the drug delivery. In addition to what you're bringing up, is the drug appropriate
Right.
for that 505B2 or an orphan drug type thing? I think, Ken.
In the interesting thing,
go ahead.
I was going to say the interesting thing on that point is if you look at the FDA, they sort of have given mixed messages, right? Again, not to knock the FDA at all, but if you look at what they said with the pain medications, right, and specifically the pain creams, there wasn't enough data associated with that, and that if we were going to allow certain things to move forward with the pain creams, right, putting aside the reimbursement issues, right, we needed to show more of a clinical need because there wasn't enough data out there. And then take a look at what was said just 2 days ago with the 503B and quinacrine. So quinacrine in this situation has been around obviously for a long period of time. I think it should be on the list. But they allowed that to be able to be used both in oral and topical format, right, from a bulk list perspective for different types of dermatological-based issues. And so I think the FDA does recognize that there is the ability to move between those dosage forms, but it's been a mixed message, and it's been a onesie and a twosie situation, right? It's only when there's a certain limited products with a very long, let me say it that way, knowledge base of what's been done in the pharmacy space when they allow a pharmacist to move forward with that.
Interesting.
And they probably take into effect the potency or the toxicological profile of that compound.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, you can take a look at quinacrine, and obviously it's been around long enough, it's been used long enough that people know how it's going to be absorbed and what the AUC is going to be.
Yeah, because I've actually repurposed compound. This comes under the repurposing story, right? I've done repurposing where FDA asked us to update the NDA, as it were, because it was approved, before many of the regulations in the 50s and 60s. But this whole area of repurposing, not as a, ANDA kind of story, repurposing under 505(b)(2), where the 503 a B could enable that early launch of a product is huge. Yeah. Especially in orphan rare diseases, it's massive because even though there are 7,000 known diseases, only 5% have a drug that's out there for them, or 5% of the diseases. Okay, and less than 10% have a development because I think it's not a large percentage have a population that's greater than 3,500 patients. Mm-hmm. And if we are talking about orphanization, which is you take, even Alzheimer's, I believe is like oncology. The problem with Alzheimer's is everybody thinks it's just one disease. It's not. It's actually a constellation of diseases. So if we were to subset it out to even single digit, low double digit of how you describe an Alzheimer's patient, you're much better off. You're more likely to get a efficacious drug against those patients. And if there's a way for us to repurpose drug, because there are a lot of drugs that come around, and at the end of the day, especially mechanism basis, on systemic biology mechanism, it's very common. In my opinion, majority of the diseases have a immunological component, right? And and there are so many drugs that have been approved for immunology-related diseases, so they could easily be used for a new disease through a different, delivery. So if there is a way for us to approve a repurposed drug with a different delivery through 505(b)(2), but then using a 503(b) organization, it's huge. It's massive.
And I think it's a possibility, and I'll give you a perfect example. So we've been talking about COVID a little bit, and what is one of the main...
COVID is a great example. Yeah.
And what's one of the drugs that we've seen that work? Steroids, dexamethasone, right? Yep. And dexamethasone obviously was never intended to be used for COVID, but when you use it now to help treat the cytokine storm that happens at the end of it, right? It's actually a great drug in that perspective. And so that it's a perfect example as to one that you could repurpose. And another way that to do this, and I agree with you, Ken, as to your point, is to look, if you could use a drug, particularly in the orphan space, where we are going through trial, it's hard to study that drug because the end population is very small, right? That's why it's an orphan drug to begin with. And you can able to help our patients, right? Whether it be first through patient choice, et cetera, through a 503(b) to get more patient access going through there. I think it's a great thing and it could help more people out. FDA's concern, and I don't want to speak for them, obviously, but I've had many conversations on this topic with them, is look, we don't want the clinical trials to become a cash show, right? We want you to pay to buy the drugs as you move forward. And so that's their biggest issue, is now having cash through the trials themselves. But I do think it needs to be balanced, right? So where you can have patient access, particularly for some of these rare diseases, through a 503(b). And I think that's something that has to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what's also been happening, I don't know if you've been following this, there's this, AI systems being used to recognize what drug could be used in what disease. Mm-hmm. And so, and they did that for COVID, right? A few things were churned out, especially in the complement system, because people believe the complement system is heavily involved in the COVID, especially long COVID, for instance. Mm-hmm. And there are drugs that have been developed for complement, targeting complement system, and AI system picked it up. Then the question is, can you then, these are existing drugs. And the reason why that whole AI coming up with an idea for a drug is failed is because there was no way to test those.
Right.
The results that the system was showing. So if there was a way to say, okay, why don't we use a 503(b) organization to create what could be given to then patients, and then through a 505(b)(2) you approve those, it'll bring a lot of investors to the space. A lot of investors. They can tie in, because a lot of money has gone into AI-based drug discovery, development, and that's been struggling. So that could really kickstart that area in a big way if that happens.
And to me, that's where I see the future, right? Everybody, where are you going as sort of Trade Association is I see it sitting in between and being that valuable resource to be able to say, look, we can help rare diseases, we can help drug shortages, and we can help the drug development process.
Yeah. And tied to that, of course, the payer has to recognize it. See, that's
Right.
the biggest problem has been the payer, payer is reimbursing for the drug and then
Right.
separately for the procedure. If they can reimburse it for the solution,
Yep.
okay, where the drug and the procedure, is considered as one, then, and then you link that to, in my case, we are also going down the path of if it doesn't work, you don't pay. So you're standing by what you're creating. That's one of the reasons for one of the companies that I'm involved in. We're going all the way to commercial. We're not trying to lob it over to another pharma to take it over, and that whole model is a mess, in my opinion. Unless you are one size fits all, spray and pray is your strategy, which has been there in pharma for such a long time. That's got to go away, and I think that's changing.
You're right. Well, in CAR T again, that went up again, but it's a perfect example, right? We can charge you about it doesn't work, you only pay $500, right, for all the services that go into it.
Absolutely. I don't know if Vivian is on the line. I think the session is going to end soon. I don't know if audience have any questions for us.
Yes, I am on the line. Yeah, are there any questions? You can put them in the chat, or you could raise your hand and ask.
I think there was one gentleman or somebody who was trying to ask the question, but we were not able to hear. But chat, I'm monitoring the chat, and I'm not seeing any questions.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything. So nobody's got any questions, because it's a really great discussion, and there's like so much coming down the pipe.
Absolutely. So what time does I think 12:40 is what we set up for, right?
Exactly, 12:40. So yeah, we're right on. So if anybody has any parting comments, we can leave with those.
No, I think I've learned a lot thanks to you guys. This is an area that I only recently started reading about. I've got the manual of compendium I have to go through now. It's the famous one that you guys probably know by heart, But the thing that I'm from thinking about the future, the thing that I'm really, really excited about, and you might want to check in this, is the 3D printing of drugs. So the way I see this happening is pharmacies are going to have a 3D printer, and they're going to print the drugs according to the profile of the patient. So create doses, medium. See, right now the doses that are created are for regulatory reasons. The only reason why warfarin has multiple doses is because it's got a very narrow therapeutic index. Okay, so by definition, pharma industry always looks for a wide therapeutic index, but that doesn't help when you're trying to titrate the dose to a patient's progress. Okay? So we are looking at, in my opinion, 3D printing in local pharmacies to print the drugs, and then ultimately it might actually end up in people's houses, okay, where prescription leading to printing, and all that they have to get is the actual tube that then is used to print the drug. And there's so much information in this space. I highly recommend you guys look at it, because that might be the future of how the 503B organization might end up. That is, you end up having your manufacturing in your house for whatever drug or vitamin or minerals or whatever you think about. Yeah.
Well, thank you, guys.